You ever have one of those nights that rearranges the furniture inside your chest? The kind that makes you recheck everything you thought you knew about people, money, and what it means to belong. This is one of those nights. I'm Maya Johnson, and for 3 winters I wore a thrift store apron, learned every crack in the dining room floor at Langford's Chop House, and kept a promise no one knew I'd even been given, until the night everything broke open. Act 1. Hook the shove. The smile, the noise. It was a private room, velvet curtains a tree that could light a small neighborhood, the kind of place where people trade apologies in fine print and consider service a convenience, not a person. Mr. Langford, tall tuxedo, sharp cufflinks that looked like small mirrors, brought his mother Margaret in for the annual family dinner. He sat like a king who forgot he was mortal, and when I reached across the table to steady Margaret's spoon, he barked, "Don't touch my mother." That line, calm and precise as a scalpel, cut the air. I froze, spoon mid-air soup trembling on my wrist. He said it again, softer now, but with teeth. "Get your hands off her." For him, I was part of the wallpaper. Inexpensive, replaceable, a hand that belonged to the room, not the people in it. But Margaret looked at me and something tiny unlatched in her face. A smile, slow, small, the way a light finds a cracked window. And I saw at first the way people miss the obvious when they're busy being important. Act 2. The long grind, the reveal, the shove back. People think being invisible is quick work. It isn't. You become a student of silence. I used to wear a uniform at a hospice, CNA, for nearly 2 decades. Learned how Parkinson's steals little things first, the way someone reaches the tiny hesitations before a swallow. When Aaron, Margaret's youngest, my Aaron, lay in that hospice bed 4 winters ago, he taught me how to sing soft, how to soothe a tremor with a fingertip. He wrapped a cheap, blinking tree around the IV pole and told me, "Tomorrow we'll be back there with them by the big tree." We were engaged secretly because the world didn't like the person he loved, and he knew it would make things messy to say it out loud. After Aaron died, there was this impossible quiet, the kind that presses on your lungs. I wanted 2 things: to sit with Margaret and to keep Aaron's promise. I applied to restaurants connected to the family, but I didn't do it to scheme or to sue. I did it because the only door left open to be near her was the one that took orders. I took off my badge, tied on an apron, learned the perfect angle to tilt a wheelchair so the airway opens, kept a small tube of thickener in my pocket, because those are the details that matter to people who need help. So when Mr. Langford called me a presumption in a suit that screamed more money than decency, I didn't answer him with legal papers. I let him rant. I let the manager Louise stammer about policies, Section 5, no contact with VIPs, like those words could erase what he'd watched every holiday from a table across the room. Me every year bringing myself to the edge of that dinner, watching Margaret, never interfering unless she asked. She didn't ask, not at first. She just watched. But that night she reached, and when she did, she reached for my hand. They assumed my place was in the kitchen. They assumed I'd be glad to be invisible. But if you've ever loved someone who needed you to show up, invisibility is a choice you make for reasons bigger than a paycheck. Act 2. The choke, the skill, the shame. Dinner came like ritual. Thick-cut steak, the kind of meal the Langfords have a photograph of on every holiday wall. I said nothing when the plate hit the table, but my hands found the thickener, and the rest came out of muscle memory. Margaret's jaw had become unreliable. The wrong texture would send food the wrong way. When a chunk of steak slipped and her lips went slate color, the room moved into slow motion. No coughing, no noise, the worst kind of choke silent, closing her airway like a door. While Mr. Langford fumbled with his phone, I stepped forward. "Give me space," I said, not loud, just precise. I leaned behind the wheelchair, not with a violent Heimlich, but with a modified compression, because osteoporosis will shatter ribs if you're not careful. A method Aaron taught me to avoid breaking what we needed to keep. 8 counts measured pressure that was enough to move the obstruction without doing more harm. Margaret cried out a terrible wet sound. The chunk flew into the tablecloth and color came back to her cheeks like rain. For a second, the room was a church of quiet. Someone knocked over a chair. Glass trembled. Then Mr. Langford looked at me. He sputtered, "You saved her life." He said it like a verdict and a confession at once. I handed him the little packet of thickener, the one I carried, the one he'd never imagined a server would know to keep. Money had paid for caregivers, but none had watched her swallow the way Aaron taught me to watch. Money buys a lot. It just doesn't buy the hours you spend awake beside someone's bed. Act 2. The history spills. That night when the manager called me into the back and Mr. Langford demanded answers. Who are you? Why did you know his name? I could have lied. I didn't. I pulled the ring from beneath my shirt that Aaron had slipped onto my finger on a hospice night when his hands shook as much as his laugh, and I told them about the letter, the one he wrote the night before he died, shaking, telling me to be there for his mother, not for money, not for revenge, but for him. Mr. Langford recoiled like someone struck by winter. The name Aaron, the name of his son that he couldn't be bothered to call in those last hours, hit his face like a mirror. A dozen truths burst at once. There was a lawsuit once filed against the estate, dismissed, then withdrawn. Some relatives had pushed that narrative to keep me out, to call me a predator. Aaron had left a note, asked me to be any way you can. The manager, Louise, blinked. The family's lawyer sister Evelyn arrived like a verdict, cold and sharp, ready to paint me as a con. Act 3. The protest, the choice, the chase. Evelyn's accusations were neat like knives filed to fit a family's need to believe a tidy thing that love is always transactional. She called me names, read the old court filings, suggested I'd orchestrated the choke to look like heroism. I didn't argue. Words are brittle against that sort of hate. Margaret, though, did something she'd never done before. She stopped eating. Not because she couldn't physically swallow, but because she could refuse, and refusal is the last true language someone is left with. The doctor said what everyone feared. She was refusing volitional. It was a protest, the only one left to someone whose body had been negotiated away by appointments, pills, and polite attendance. Mr. Langford had 2 days to keep his palace of polite duty, the cleaners, the caregivers, the distance, or go find the woman he'd called a servant and bring her home, because that was the condition Margaret carved into the quiet between heartbeats. Find her. Bring her back. Don't come home without her. I walked away that night because I had no coat, no ride, and because sometimes being kicked out is cheaper than being acknowledged. I sat on a cemetery bench under a moon that bit, looking at Aaron's stone and the snow collected in my hair. It was there, cold and honest, that I heard footsteps. Mr. Langford came. He had a Range Rover under him and a shame under his skin that money couldn't bribe away. He knelt in the snow. He read Aaron's letter with hands that trembled like mine had that night in hospice. He admitted, in a voice cracked by weather and realization, that he had failed to be present. He wanted to know how to fix it. I held out the only thing Aaron had asked me, to protect the promise that someone would be there any way they could. Act 3. The aftermath, the small wins, the open wound. A year later, the dining room looks different to me. I sit at the table, not in an apron, in a dress the color of old holiday cards. The empty chair holds a photograph. Aaron's laughter fills it in a way that never replaces him, but reminds us why we fought to keep a place for him. Margaret laughs, truly laughs, the way someone does when they know they are finally seen. Mr. Langford comes to dinner every week. He learned how to cut food the right way, how to pause, how to be present. Evelyn still glares from the doorway sometimes. Power and denial don't vanish overnight. But what matters is this: a promise kept in small gestures is sometimes louder than a will signed in a fancy office. I kept my promise by being there, not by taking the money. Aaron's letter was not a legal strategy. It was a plea for presence. I chose the apron because the apron was the safest way to be near the person I loved, and because sometimes the only way to belong is to stay when no one invites you. This story is messy. It has the ugly parts we pretend don't exist. The family who believes wealth is a substitute for care. The relative who weaponizes doubt the system that expects loyalty only when it is convenient. But it also has the honest parts: a hand that knows how to save a life, a letter that asks for a final kindness, A mother who uses the only power she has left to teach her son what matters. So here's what I want you to do. If this made you think of someone you brushed past, a neighbor, a coworker, an elderly person in your building, tell me about it. Do you think I should have stayed and fought harder when Evelyn accused me? Was Mr. Langford right to kneel in the snow? Or should he have done more before it was almost too late? Drop a comment. Argue with me. Defend who you think deserves it. Tell me if you've ever been invisible and what finally made you feel seen. If this touched you, like and subscribe helps us keep telling stories about people we nearly miss. And maybe, just maybe, next time one of us reaches out, someone will actually take our hand.